Welcome to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin with Bobby Mixa. Bobby, it is not high summer, but it is summertime. How are you?
Good, Andrew. It's been a long time since we last chatted.
I know we have had a lot of things going on in our lives, and we've had some good conversations recently, but we've it's been a little while. So we decided today, we've got a bunch of good guests lined up for later in the summer, but we decided to kind of begin the summer with a conversation about books. So we very much hope we expect our audience is the kind of audience that wants to hear about books. So we're going to do that, and maybe our audience will discover something new, or maybe they can suggest things to us after hearing what we're interested in.
Okay, I look forward to delving into this.
Yeah, so we've each selected 5 books to talk about. For my part, anyway, the selections I've made are they might be somewhat predictable. You might not be surprised by the ones that I picked, Bobby, but I've avoided a lot of things like, some of the selections that I might have made if they were like pick your all-time 5 books that you would have to take to a desert island. These picks aren't exactly that. They might be in that 5, but I've also left off a lot of things that I might have picked. The ones that I picked are kind of, I'd have to say, I don't know, things that are kind of shaping my imagination now, or maybe have been for the last few years, I would say,
Yeah.
like maybe more than the things that kind of have been influencing me all along. So let's just get right to it. And, maybe that's, I don't know. We're going to surprise each other. I don't know what you've picked. You don't know what I've
Yeah.
picked. So why don't you kick it off?
Maybe I'll preface it with the same thing that these aren't necessarily the 5 books that I take to an island. But these are books that have played a pretty significant role in, as you say, shaping my imagination and how I see things. But also, they're books that I've also kind of sometimes have disagreed with over the years. But nevertheless, when I kind of look back on things, I see these things as coming, or actually as pivotal moment, and taking me down a certain path of research and interest that I didn't have before that. So maybe I'll begin with mine. Mine is actually the first book I'm going to mention is one of these books. I think they just republished it. But for a while there, this book was out of print. And I think that I think it was out of print for a while. It was really hard for me to find this book. It was actually recommended to me by a professor that I had at the JP2 Institute named Dr. Nicholas Healy, because I went to him and I wanted to write this, paper for actually DC Schindler's class. Um, and he recommended I take a look at this book. Um, and luckily, CUA had it in the library. And then actually at Mundelein Seminary, because I worked there a year later, they ended up having it as well. But when I had to return it, the book immediately went up on the book sale for $1. And if you went online, this thing was like worth 100 something dollars on Amazon. But online, but at Mundelein Seminary the book sale, it was up there for $1. So I grabbed it, and the book is the English title is The Failure of Technology by Friedrich George Junger, the brother of the
Yes, yes.
famous Ernst Junger. Um,
Yeah.
this book was written in, I think, the 1930s, and he had to bury it. I think Friedrich Junger was a politician, but during the Nazi era, I'm not exactly sure what happened to him, but I know he had to bury this book. He didn't publish it yet, but he actually had it buried underneath his house, I believe. But the book is a diagnosis of actually not only technique, okay, and weird this perfection. The book, the actual German title is Das Perfektion. You can help me here, Andrew. I think it's Das Perfektion, the perfection of technology, which
Yeah.
includes the kind of breakdown, as you see here, the demise of man.
Yeah.
And so this book is a great in some ways. Each chapter is very, very short. But he, yeah, here's the discard stamp.
That's
Um,
wild.
yeah, but the book just goes through everything. So here's a couple of samples of the titles. He says one is actually the first title chapter is literature of a danger zone. Then the
Mm.
second is delusion of saving of the saving of labor, the delusion of wealth, the distribution of poverty, the pillage of the earth, technology versus the profit motive, and so on and so forth. Okay. But
So
this
is
book,
this, can I just
yeah,
ask
yeah,
you,
just jump in.
is this like I remember we used to talk about this book and I haven't actually read it, but I remember seeing that very book in your office in our old
Yeah.
workplace. And is it fair to say that it is an anti-technology book, or is it a book that is trying to sort of dispel or kind of um, engage with the claims of what technology is capable of, or how would you categorize it?
I think the book is basically getting at a mentality, or as D.L. Schindler would say, kind of like a certain metaphysics that
Hmm.
sees everything in terms of a collection of parts with absence of wholes. So it's kind of
Hmm.
like if you want to put it in like almost like Yusuf Pieper is going at the same thing as book on leisure, a total abandonment of contemplation. And
Hmm.
so, everything is seen in as basically a part of this great mechanism that your techniques are there, to control nature, to bring things about. But yet, in the entire way, you're not seeing to the heart or to the depth of things. So I think,
Hmm.
and then he basically diagnoses throughout each of these different realms. He even talks about nutrition and how eating a whole apple, like a whole apple, is not the same thing as actually taking a couple vitamins with the same chemicals in it. It's just
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
well, it might be for your nutritionist, but they're entirely different things. So this kind of reduction of reality to parts outside of parts is
Hmm.
for him the major problem.
Yeah. Do you know, by the way, that his brother, Ernst Jünger, saved his life in World War One?
Oh, I didn't know that.
Um, yeah. Ernst Jünger, I didn't pick any Ernst Jünger books. I thought about it, but I'm very influenced by Ernst Jünger in recent times. And but it's really out of the same family. These two brothers have just this fascinating view of the modern world.
Yeah.
So
And it's just
it would,
interesting. Their interests are so,
yeah.
broad.
Hmm.
Like Ernst Jünger himself, isn't there like a beetle named after
Yeah.
him?
Yeah. I mean, he was an entomologist, really. I mean, for
Yeah.
a big part of his life. Would you say, by the way, Bobby, and I don't want to give anything else away if you are going to pick something by this author, but is this Jünger and this book on technology influenced somewhat by Heidegger?
You know what? I'm actually not exactly sure about this Junger's influence by Heidegger because
Yeah.
Heidegger, I'm trying to look at when he wrote the essay, The Question Concerning Technology.
Oh, yeah, because they would have
Um,
been almost contemporaries, right?
yeah, oh yeah. Well, Ernst Jünger
Yeah.
used to go over to Heidegger's house for these little
Right.
gatherings. Um, and I know
Yeah.
that definitely he was influenced. But this mentality that I think Heidegger was getting at. Now I think that unlike Heidegger, he doesn't necessarily see it as like an inevitable fate that the West will go to uh,
Yeah.
to this type of metaphysics, and hence you have the decline of the West. Um, but I do think, and I'm not exactly sure whether or not he was a practicing Christian.
Hmm.
Interesting thing with, I always love it that Ernst Jünger decides to become Catholic when he's like 100 years old. Then
Yeah.
he dies when he's like what, 102?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and it has to be said about Ernst Jünger. He didn't seem, and like you and I have both watched that Swedish documentary that was made right at the end of his
oh
life,
yeah,
and he talks about all kinds of things. And it doesn't seem to me in that interview that he is particularly anti-technology or anti um or even that pessimistic. I don't know. I mean, he seems pretty, I mean, so I don't know. I don't know how that would relate to his brother's book, but it doesn't seem to me that Ernst Jünger kind of at the end of the 20th century was sitting there going, well, we're in hell now and it's only going to get worse. He doesn't really seem to be like that to me.
yeah, yeah. But then, you have somebody like Heidegger who says only a God can save us. in response to all of
Yeah.
the various things that, tech the condition that technology has set up. So
Hmm.
Andrew, I don't I'll save my next book. So what's yours?
Okay, my first book, I'm going to go back a few centuries and to a neighboring country. And my first book is Blaise Pascal's Pensée.
Hmm.
And here's why I'm going to talk about that. So you know, Bobby, that I majored in French as an undergraduate. I went away to Oxford and studied French literature there. I started off doing medieval stuff. My supervisor left, so I switched over to early modern Renaissance stuff. And my supervisor for my thesis was a man named Richard Cooper. He's still alive. He's a Catholic, actually. I didn't know that at the time because I wasn't really, plugged into Catholic things then. But interesting guy. He's a great scholar of Montaigne and of Rabelais, and also poetry. And I was writing my thesis on poetry. For whatever reason, Pascal was somebody who was on my radar. He was somebody we talked about occasionally in this area of French studies, but he wasn't he wasn't really read. Montaigne was the giant in terms of like the kind of wise man of this era. So, although I always knew who Pascal was, I hadn't really read him in depth. I knew a bit about him. He would pop up in different contexts and stuff like that. Fast forward a long time, and I'm watching a movie by Eric Romer called My Night at Maud's, which has kind of at its core this question of Pascal's wager. And I think it's a really brilliant movie and a really fascinating way that philosophy is played out, right, in the arts. I wrote an article about My Night at Maud's and read some Pascal when I was, and kind of researched and read some Pascal when I was, and I had always had the French editions of Pascal. I'm holding up this English Penguin Classic here, but really hadn't really read it in French or in English too much, but started reading it. Then last year, Pope Francis issued a document, basically a sort of, I don't know what you'd even call it, like a tribute to Pascal on the
Hmm.
400th anniversary of his birth, I believe. And I was asked to write an article about it, so I did. So I read a lot more Pascal, and I read the article and engaged with it. And all of these things combined, like my background in French studies, and then kind of this encounter that I fell into with Pascal over the course of a couple of years that I wasn't even really looking for. These things have combined to create for me just one of the great thinkers that is in my mind. So to me, Pascal is just so important, and he actually, in some respects, I'm naming him first, but he comes after in my formation, especially as a Catholic, a whole lot of other thinkers that came long after him. But in some respects, he I now see is somebody who influenced them, namely on this question of living in the reality of God. Like, if it's true that God is real, then what does that mean? And reading Pascal, you get that. You so get that. And so you have this wonderful book, The Pensée, which in some respects is so unlike a modern work of Christian apologetics. It's so not polished. It doesn't hang together. It's just one thought after another. And that's why I brought up Montaigne, because it's sort of, Montaigne just wrote about this, wrote about that. But there, for Montaigne, it was these like beautiful essays that he kind of pieced these things together, right? Pascal thought one day he was going to write this big book of kind of defending Christianity, and he never did it. So what's left is the Pensée. So anyway, I'll leave it at that and just say, well, actually, I was going to share one little thing out of here, which is talking about the reality of God. I had encountered in C.S. Lewis years before, and I hadn't picked any C.S. Lewis, but I had encountered in C.S. Lewis years before the idea of time. And time, he says, time is where well, basically, the present is where time and eternity touch each other. So it's like we don't ever want to be like living our lives for one day. We don't want to be like either kind of living in the future or living in the past, right? And you get that so strongly in Pascal's Pensée. He talks about how the thing is that the present is painful. You don't really want to live in the present. You would rather kind of live in the future or live in the past, but it's actually in the present where you have to be. And he talks about that in a lot of different places in the Pensée, but there's one part early on where he says, if we don't live in the present, he says, then we never actually live. And he says, but actually we're hoping to live. And he doesn't mean Christian hope, like what we focus on, but basically just like that life then just becomes this aspiration. It becomes fake, basically, if you're unwilling to engage with the present. So that's my first pick, Pascal's Pensée.
It's interesting that you pick him. I like him because he's one of these kind of occasional thinkers. It's
Yeah.
just, you don't have it necessarily systematically all laid out there. But also the fact that I mean, this was discovered after his death, right? Posthumously, right? Um, it was
Yeah, the
discovered,
Pensée. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
the
Yeah, he
fact
was a
too,
mathematician and, a great thinker and writer and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, this was not, he wasn't like publishing these things in, I don't know, whatever
yeah,
newspapers and things,
some
right?
theological journal, but it's yeah, I actually it's funny that you picked him because my next choice is someone who greatly last night actually I was reading this again, and he says that that Pascal is perhaps he loves reading Pascal. It's one of his favorite writers of all time. But my next book is actually this is recommended to me once again for somebody at the John Paul II Institute, Leslie Rice. Um, I was thinking about I was taking some class on science and genetics and anyways, I was trying to like look at actually what's like the metaphysics operative here in the way people think about biology today. And she said, okay, well, maybe I'm not going to recommend a book for you here that is necessarily exactly on that question, but just to get into the mind of somebody who kind of is getting at this stuff and kind of has a little bit of a pessimistic view of the sciences, even though he won the Nobel. I'm not sure, did he win the Nobel Prize? I gotta check into that, but was actually like in the 1960s upheld as somebody who is like the most prominent I think biochemist around, and his name is Aaron Shagroff, and this is the Heraclitean fire. Okay, let me show you and this is his, um, this is kind of like a memoir, Heraclitean fire. It says sketches from a life before nature.
Hmm.
Um, and this guy, he was actually a scientist who discovered um, the base of DNA, like the AGT whatever C nucleoacidic base.
Hmm.
But on the side, kind of like Pascal, he was actually. I mean, if you read this, you're like, wait a minute. I've never met a scientist this well educated in the humanities who read everything and was like lamenting the education of these young scientists he was meeting that were
Hmm.
so focused just on science, math, engineering, mathematics. They had no humanistic formation. This guy was like, he was a musician himself. He mastered so many languages. I mean, like, I think his aspiration was to learn something like 15 languages. Um, and he read everything. And you get a real good sense of that in this memoir. But he does have a very, very, say, pessimistic outlook on where things are going. In the beginning of his book, he talks about the day that he learned about the explosion of the atomic bomb. And he says that the scientists' hands are bloodied. He says
Hmm.
the scientific community um, is actually responsible for this. That's the first thing he begins with. Um, and he talks about, though, he says, okay, splitting the atom was one thing, but splitting the genome, which he's very concerned about, he says that's going to be much worse.
Hmm.
And anyways, that's just one side of what he just kind of like really like warning that he's giving people. But if you read this, you get a sense of what does it mean to be a well-educated human being. But for those of you who are listening or in education, it might be a really good way of forming your students who want to go into the sciences to say, hey, you should be mastering the languages. You shouldn't get rid of French, German from your
Hmm.
university, even philosophy. but those things should be like foremost for shaping the scientific mind.
Hmm.
He used to say that doing science was his hobby. Um, but anyways, so that's my second book.
Let me ask you, because I'm so ignorant about science. Have they split the genome? Is that something they're trying to do?
Well,
I'm so ignorant.
yeah, well, I mean, I think he's talking about the attempt, right? Like to like, get the whole the human
Oh, I
genome
see.
code, the code. I don't.
I think they do have that, don't they?
No, they do. They got that back what in
Yeah.
like the 90s.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
but he was concerned about what that was going to lead to in terms of playing God.
Hmm.
And I know that even he had big concerns about IVF too, and like this manipulation and getting involved. But yeah.
Yeah. It reminds me of the quote from Dr. Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park that I always butcher, but I have gotten correct in print a few times. But the quote about, we were so concerned about whether we could, we didn't stop to think whether we should. And it seems like a lot of scientific so-called progress is doesn't stop to ask that question or just
Yeah.
thinks it'll all kind of work itself out somehow, that there's this kind of net positive, but yeah,
Well, that
the old
question doesn't even
you have
make
to break some
sense.
eggs. Yeah. Yeah.
Like should, I mean, it's something else.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, that's not our domain. We're not philosophers, man. We're
yeah,
scientists.
it's above my
Well,
pay
we
grade
yeah, well,
to
we need
answer
some
those.
philosopher scientists, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I promise that will be like one of the last of my very, very pessimistic books.
That doesn't seem so pessimistic, and I like that choice because I don't recall you ever mentioning that book to me. So I am happy to know about it.
Well,
It's
I
very
found it
good.
the other day. I had it in one of my boxes, and this one I was so happy that I kept this book because when I moved to Poland, I had to get rid of some
Mm.
some books, and this book was something I definitely was not going to get rid of.
Yeah, who knows what books you would pick if you had access to your archives in Chicago, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, you ready for my second pick?
Yeah.
Okay, I have you entirely to thank for my admiration for this writer, and it's Luigi Giussani.
Oh yes.
And the
Yeah.
book is called The Religious Sense. Did you pick this book as well?
No, 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 I didn't.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, so I had never heard of Luigi Giussani until we started working together. And I remember that you recommended him to me at the same time that we were talking about the Italian filmmaker Paolo Sorrentino, and in particular his movie The Great Beauty, which I watched and I made a video about, and I just absolutely love that movie. I love his TV show that he did for HBO called The Young Pope and the Next Pope, the New Pope, the New Pope. I always forget what the second season is called. And I've seen a bunch of his other movies too. I think he's fantastic. But he made a movie called The Hand of God just a few years ago, and I think that movie best illustrates something that is in this book by Giussani, The Religious Sense, namely this thing that Giussani calls the elementary experience. And Giussani has this whole thing at the beginning of this book about how, like, our apparatus, and I guess this comes from Plato. I don't know, but like, you know a lot better than I do, Bobby, as a philosopher or philosophy student. But the that our apparatus for judging the world is in us. That is a gift to us as a part of our having been made, right? It's a gift that we have and that we have to exercise. And Giussani says, like, unless you exercise that, you're kind of not really living. Um, and he says the way that you sort of come alive to all this is that you have inevitably this thing that he calls an elementary experience. And it's kind of like a coming of age moment where it's like you suddenly understand, like, your deepest desire that comes from within you that you can't explain is, in a sense, like to touch reality, to touch the source of like what has given you life. And my goodness, the first time when I read, and I know there are people who are real cynical about Giussani and just think it's all just sort of romantic gobbledygook. I love it. I absolutely love it. I can't get enough of it. And when I first read, especially the first chapter of this book, The Religious Sense, I was just like, thank you, God. You have provided for me an understanding of what I have been feeling in my life for all these many years. Um, this is the first book in a trilogy. I have the other two actually on the shelf behind me. But and all three of them are absolutely terrific. I've marked up all three of them, but this first one, The Religious Sense, I just can't recommend this highly enough. I think anybody out there listening to us or watching us who hasn't read it, just highly recommend it. And thank you, Bobby, for putting it on my radar.
Well, no, reality. What's that scene in the end of Hand of God, though, when the director is telling the young like Santino, what is it?
Yeah.
What is that? What does he say to him exactly on the beach?
I'm
Where
blanking a little bit now, but yeah, he basically says the young man, he says he's a young version of Paolo Sorrentino in many respects. It's an autobiographical movie. And so this young Fabietto, isn't that his name? I'm now blanking. It's been a
yeah,
while, but anyway, I've written about this movie. I love it. He meets this great Italian filmmaker and he says to him, I want to make movies. I want to make movies. And he says, I want to go to Rome and I want to learn movies. And the director says to him, don't do it. Don't go to Rome. Look, I mean, you just look out right there where you are. And I forget how it sort of proceeds from there, but it's basically like he's saying, don't you don't you might you might actually take too long to have that elementary experience if you think it like has to have a certain shape or like has to you have to go do it over there or like whatever. And anyway, it's just a brilliant thing about art, about the soul. It's
but he also
wonderful.
finding like it's almost like the call. He's
Yeah, the
been
call.
called to be to become an artist, and
Yeah,
I love that. I love that the movie how it
yeah.
ends though with the little monk, and
The last scene on the train, yeah, he's listening to his Napoli song.
Napoli song, man. I've
Yeah,
listened to that song so many times since watching
yeah.
that. But I love it though how Italian film it's almost kind of like a Dante thing, you know, it's almost like
Hmm.
they've all been sent into exile to
Yeah.
Rome in some respects, and they're nostalgic for their their hometown. And
Yeah, you get this in a lot of European cinema, by the way, just as an aside. You get this in a cinema in a filmmaker like Pedro Almodovar, who makes movies, Spanish movies based in Madrid, but there are always these characters who are sort of like their town always kind of intermingles with their experience in this
yeah.
like sort of, urban life. And the same with Sorrentino movies with Rome. Same with it comes up in Kieślowski's movie, The Double Life of Veronique.
Oh yeah,
It
yeah.
actually comes up in a bunch of his movies. This idea of this sort of what is home. And anyway, I
Yeah.
digress. But
Well, I was listening to on the way home today. I've got the Cinema Paradiso soundtrack
mhm,
in the car, and so I was listening to that, and I love how in the beginning of that movie you kind of have like I think it's the phones ringing, and it's almost like the string the is unraveling as if he's being pulled back to Sicily. And so it's
yeah,
then he remembers and he goes back to his little, when he's a little boy in Sicily. And but the whole thing seems to me that like, and he's lost in Rome, he's like in exile. But
mhm,
the same, this love of one's home, it's great. It's interesting how yeah, that shows up in, I never thought of that in European cinema so much. But it seems to me that like what Giussani grasped and what that elementary experience is about is you're touching in some ways that home of how do I put it of
right, yeah,
walking in the garden with God. I
yeah,
mean, in some
right,
ways, and
yeah.
um, anyways, kind of the next book, Andrew. I was thinking, I'm like, I'm sure Andrew is picking this book, um, but
All right, what is it?
this book, okay, I'll tell you a little bit about this. The next two books I've chosen were both recommended to me by actually Bishop Barron when I started working in 2009 for them. That summer, I did some stuff with the research and for Catholicism, and I think I was going to come. I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do with them, but I was going on vacation I was going to go with my parents to Portland, and we're going to drive along the coast to San Francisco. And I mean, talk about a beautiful journey. But
Hmm.
I asked Bishop Barron, I'm like, usually when I go on these trips, I wanted to always take a good book with me. It was more of like a retreat and a time to read and to take in these beautiful sights than necessarily following the extensive itinerary that my dad put together. But the two books, or the first book that Bishop Barron recommended me, because I said, okay, I need to read something. I just graduated from undergrad, and I felt like the theology there wasn't the best. But he said, hey, you should go read this book, Catholicism by Henri de
Oh, I'm
Lubac.
so glad you picked that. I did not pick that one, but I'm so glad that we get to talk about it.
Okay, good. So this
Say it
book,
again. I just talked over you. Tell our listeners
no, no,
again what
no,
it is.
Catholicism, Christ and the Common Destiny of Man. Um, this book, I remember just like the first page, and then the pages of footnotes that follow, one sentence, each sentence. Um, and then all the collection of writings of the church fathers in the back, and
Hmm.
ending with this integral humanism. This thing was like the answer for me. I felt like, okay, I know Catholicism. I know it's true because partially, and this book affirms it for me.
Hmm.
Um, and I know that a young Joseph Ratzinger was greatly influenced by this book. I don't know if I don't know John Paul II writing about like saying that he read this book, but I know that he was always, even as a bishop in Krakow, he was writing to Henri de Lubac very often. Hey, what do you think about this? Well, hey, I'm working on this book that's going to become Person and Act. Um,
Hmm.
and I know that he, as Pope, bowed to Henri de Lubac when he came to Paris and
Hmm.
called him the theologian. Um, but this book was just excellent. And at the John Paul II Institute, they had us read extensively from this book. But always what struck me was, and I can't find the exact line. I thought I underlined it here, but I couldn't find it. Um, Gaudium et Spes 22, okay, about, you know, um, the new Adam, um,
Hmm.
which, our friend Larry Chapp has named his podcast after,
Hmm.
I think is almost verbatim taken from this book.
Yeah. Yeah. That book, that's another one. I'm so grateful. That's another one that I read after I had already become Catholic. I was completely convinced of the claims of the Catholic Church. And then, after the fact, I read that book and I felt so good about my decision. It's that book more than any other to me just makes it so clear, to be a Catholic, the Catholic Church is not, I say this all the time, but the Catholic Church is not a denomination. It's not sort of just like the best way to be a Christian. It's not the best of many options. It's not the thing you should prefer. I mean, people like de Lubac, and especially in that book, are making the claim that it's just reality. Again, there's
Yeah.
there's that word. I mean, it's just the way you're called to be alive.
Mhm.
And my goodness, does he make a convincing case in that book, I think.
Absolutely. And what's interesting too is kind of like along the lines of what Benedict does in Spe Salvi, that
Hmm.
salvation is a communal thing. It's a social
Hmm.
thing. It's not just the individual walking on, his or her own to be with Christ. I mean, it encompasses all of reality. Um, that's what I like about the Lubach, and I like about people like Hans von Balthasar, and Giussani was good friends with all of them. Comunio,
Totally.
I mean, I'm sure Giussani, I mean, heck, I don't know about Giussani's role in the formation of Comunio, but I do know that his order of priests that come out of Comunio Liberazione, they're the ones who actually are taking care of the John Paul II Institute. They lead the Comunio groups, and I
Hmm.
mean, and then you have the journal Comunio. They all write for that, so it's all kind of in that vein, that Gaudium et Spes 22 vein. So
Yeah, we're kind of shameless fans of that whole thing, I would say, wouldn't you, Bobby?
yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, to me, there's a book by Robert Royal. I got it over there. And, called Deeper Vision. And I feel like these are the people who have that vision.
Hmm.
DeGee is mentioned in that.
Yeah.
And it's not to, we're not meant to just like read these people in the past, but by reading them, it's like osmosis. We become that too. We have
Hmm.
that vision. And it's not a superficial just seeing Christ at the center of all things, but it's a real like you really actually have a disclosure
Yeah.
of like the foundations of love of the faith is just in all things, and
Yeah.
it's definitely not superficial. It's not like a Diet Coke Catholicism, if you want to call it that. And and this is not to like make
Yes.
fun of
Yes.
people who are I mean, I know a lot of people who say, oh, they're just theologically wrong. That's fine, okay, but you can't say that they're superficial. There's some richness there that you have to chew on. And like, yeah, I think there's probably problems in a lot of this stuff. And this next book that I'm going to recommend after you go, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's probably I don't agree with this author, but man, does he make you chew on stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm going to do for my third pick, then I'm going to go slightly out of order. I was going to do one, but I feel like I really ought to do the one I was going to do after. And that is this book, Hans Urs von Balthasar, Prayer. Here's why I picked it. I actually picked this instead of the Lubac Catholicism because of the kind of special story that I attached to this particular book by Balthasar. I also should say right up front, I haven't really read much else by Balthasar. I'm not really ashamed to admit that. I haven't been able to read the giant, theological tomes. I've read about them and I've dipped in here and there and that sort of thing. But this book, Prayer, is a book that I have read cover to cover with a pencil and has made a big impact on me. Here's when I read it. I read it the summer of 2018. I read it in a hotel room in Austin, Texas, where I had to stay for 2 weeks. This was in my final days as a priest of the Episcopal Church before I became Catholic a few months later. And I had to accompany my bishop, the Episcopal Bishop of Tennessee, a wonderful man named John Bowerschmidt, to church meetings that lasted 2.5 weeks in Austin, Texas. I didn't have a whole lot to do during this time. I was required to kind of help out in certain ways with various meetings and stuff that was going on, but I got to do two really great things. One was I got to watch a lot of the 2018 World Cup, which France won, and I was very happy about that. And the other thing was I got to read a lot, and I read this book, Prayer by Hans Urs von Balthasar. Here's why I thought it was super significant. When I was in divinity school at Yale Divinity School, training to become an Episcopal priest, I took a systematic theology sequence with a theologian named Miroslav Volf, a Croatian American who trained in Germany. He's kind of a Barthian, I would say, Karl Barth, but he also had a lot of affection. He had a lot of affection actually for Ratzinger, but he didn't teach us Ratzinger. We took this two semester sequence of systematic theology with Miroslav Volf, reading all of Christian doctrine through the lens of Karl Barth and Karl Rahner. So that was kind of like the Protestant and the Catholic. Those were the two kind of modern theologians that were given to us. When I read this Balthasar book, when I was not yet Catholic, I thought, how in the world could he have made us read all this Rahner when we could have read Balthasar? Because in this book, among the many, many profound things that Balthasar says, is he does not criticize Rahner like by name, but he does say repeatedly things along the lines of what the world doesn't need is a new answer from the church, which seems to me precisely what Rahner is trying to say, that the world does need a new answer from the church, right? But what Balthasar is saying is that we are the ones who have the problem. Like we're the ones who are so kind of desensitized to reality that the same old thing seems to bore us or have no effect on us anymore. But he's like, the same old thing is the most important thing that there could possibly be. Namely, like you're called through contemplation essentially to kind of like stand at the intersection of heaven and earth. And like that's ultimately what the life of prayer is to Balthasar. I read this, it was just mind blowing to me. Again, maybe like the Giussani, somebody might be out there listening and go, oh man, this guy really needs to read some Thomas Aquinas or something. He's just like way too woo about all of this stuff. But I got to tell you, it totally works for me. And when I discovered later on that people like Ratzinger and John Paul II and other like really, really important people think that this guy Balthazar is the bee's knees, I that was kind of enough for me. So hugely important book for me at an important time in my life.
Yeah. No, that book, I remember years ago, actually Father Steve Bruno recommended that book.
Hmm.
And what always struck me was it was great to actually have somebody go into the depths of prayer. And I felt like, he really gets at that. You join in the missions of the Trinity. And
Yeah.
this the whole way that he works out his understanding of the human person, his
Hmm.
understanding of, you know, reality is grounded fundamentally in prayer.
Yeah.
I remember in college, I took a good course um, just on prayer. And I actually I signed up for the class because I was interested in it. But then I thought, okay, wait a minute. Maybe I should take this course in economics because maybe that will look better, you know.
Hmm.
And then I remember the teacher actually found me on campus because he knew I signed up for the course. And he said, "Hey, Mixa, what are you doing going into economics?" He's like, "Come back into the prayer course." I thought,
Mm.
okay, well, but nobody's going to take this seriously. But that course was such a pivotal moment for me because it opened up,
Hmm.
actually like, yeah, this is the fundamental thing. This is really what it's all about. Um, and we didn't read Balthazar's book in that course, but we did read Augustine's Confessions.
Yeah.
And I remember I liked reading that book on prayer. The whole thing in Augustine is just nothing but coming out of prayer. You feel like it's just a dialogue with God. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say just one last thing from my part anyway is I think that comparison to Augustine's Confessions is apt because Balthazar is very concerned in this book prayer about the question that St. Paul asks in Romans, namely like this issue of we don't know how to pray as we ought, right? And Balthazar is like if there ever was a time in human history we don't know how to do that, it's now.
mm,
And I think that's something that Augustine was wrestling with too. Like how am I supposed to do this? Like I've tried all these different options, tried Manichaeism, I've sort of tried this sort of, super form of Platonism, and that almost worked, but didn't quite. And I kind of think that's like Balthasar is sort of posing the same challenge to us in the modern world that Augustine was experiencing in his day, that, that there is, and this maybe connects to Giussani as well, that there is like we've got to find that authentic connection. Otherwise, nothing's going to mean anything.
well, it's like, oh yeah, just all these techniques. You see these people turning into like transcendental meditation, breathing
Yeah,
techniques, but at the end of the day, it's encountering the you, this kind of, as like Buber talks about
yeah, yeah,
the fundamental person or persons, and that makes a demand on you and draws you then into the depths. Now, maybe I'll transition to something that um, actually isn't. I believe it's rooted in prayer. I hope. Um, but I came upon this book. Bishop Barron was the one who recommended this book to me as part of my reading. And I have to be honest, it took me like 3 years to read this book. Actually, I when I was getting married, this was one of the books that I brought out to Poland. And I can see the coffee stains still from you know, on this book. But I just chewed on this book. And I'll just mention it now. It's John Milbank's Theology and Social Theory Beyond
uh,
Secular Reason. Now, like in 2008, I remember this was like when you had the recession, and I don't know but for me, when I graduated in 2009, I just became very, very, very suspicious of many of the institutions that we had in the West. And I just was
mhm.
thinking, okay, this whole buildup, because I was having a hard time finding a job a little bit and getting worried about the future. And then hearing all these explanations of this thing called the economy, and then what's like reality, all these things being explained to me. And then you had like the new atheism and just this kind of like understanding of what is what is real? What is the real? And so, anyways, and I was thinking too, like, okay, well, what does this philosophy, theology stuff that I'm interested in have to do with any of that? And like, how did we get to where we are today? Where in the past, like, 15, 17, that had to do, like, everybody thought that had, like, that was the most important thing.
Hmm.
Whereas today, it's kind of brushed aside. And so I was maybe I'll preface it getting into this with like I'm not so much influenced by this book as much, but when I was in 2008, a lot of my teachers were reading this book, Charles Taylor's Secular Age. And so I was
Hmm.
trying to think through like these genealogies almost of like how did we get to where we are today? And what I liked about Milbank, at least, he's a bold guy. I mean
Hmm.
he sometimes I like, man, where are you going with this? Um,
A great
and
follow on Twitter, by the way, John Milbank.
yes,
Everybody should follow him.
but he has this line in the beginning of the book that I thought was just profound. He says, "Once there was no secular, and the secular was not latent, waiting to fill more space with the steam of the purely human. Okay, when the pressure of the sacred was relaxed. Instead, there was the single community of Christendom." Okay.
Hmm.
Anyways, I'll go on. But then he says this. He says something about, I'm trying to find the exact line here, but he talks about the false humility of modern theology. And I thought that actually this boldness was exactly what we needed. And
Hmm.
who does he end with? He ends with Augustine. So I
Hmm.
thought, his little journey through Hegel and Marx and then ending with Augustine was something that was just was right on. So like Balthazar said, we need to get back to these things.
I I've got to take a look at that book myself. But that's a good endorsement of it for sure, Bobby.
No, it's a good book. I mean, it's pretty heavy. And I have to be honest, I don't think I understood most of it. But I think the little that I did, I don't know, it kind of set me on a course. I got interested in the radical orthodoxy stuff,
Hmm.
and later, just saying that God is in some ways more real than anything.
Yeah.
That to me, that was was I don't know, that really I don't know, changed my way of thinking about things. And so I went and I read this collection of essays in this thing called Radical Orthodoxy. That was like a big splash in the 90s.
Hmm.
Um, and I remember seeing this guy's name, Michael Hanby, in that
Hmm.
collection. And I remember because I was thinking about going to the John Paul II Institute. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that's the same guy. And so I went up to Hanby and I said, hey, weren't you that guy into, because I later had him as a teacher. I said, weren't you the guy who wrote for Radical Orthodoxy? He's like, yeah, I studied under Milbank, da 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 da, da, but now I'm Catholic. He's like, that stuff's all good, but you just have to become Catholic at the end
Yeah.
of the day.
Well, that's right. I think that's right. And yeah, Michael Hanby, friend of the show, a former guest on the show.
Yeah.
We'll have him back. What a great thinker. Yeah, I think something that when you talked about the kind of financial crisis of 2008 and how that kind of created this like unsettling feeling, I felt that very strongly at that time. I felt it also before that in 2001, when 9/11 happened. And since then I've been reflecting on all of that a lot. I mean, the pandemic did it maybe more than any time in my life, I would say. Where I think back to the 1990s when I was a kid, and even then I loved things, or a teenager, and I loved things like the X-Files. And there is this sense that despite the victory of the West in the Cold War, right, that there's still like there was this like unease, there was this like rot underneath the surface of prosperity, and it seems like it has come out, and it does seem like the longer we live with that, the more it does make sense. I know it's kind of being like boiling it down too far, maybe, but I think that's the right way to think about it, to say that the only thing to do is, as you say, like to become Catholic, just to kind of decide, okay, like I have to live with my ultimate hope in like locked in my sights now, because there were generations before me that lived with a certain, I don't know, with their expectations fixed on something else, but I just can't do that. I just things seem too uncertain.
Yeah, I don't know, but 2008, it just
Hmm.
seemed to me that the foundations that I felt were so secure just started to crack.
Hmm.
And I, I come from like a middle class, patriotic American family. And, it was never, you just always, rooted for America the whole way. And I still do.
Yeah.
I'm a proud American in Poland. But at the same time, some of these things that I felt like I put my faith in, as being the really real, just kind of showed its real face. And
Hmm.
after, with all the social media platforms and all these technology companies that really, really, really started taking over things after 2008, it just to
Hmm.
me seemed like, well, we're not in the same world anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
The smartphone took over.
took
Yeah. All of
over.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, but even, just these behemoths that
Hmm.
I feel enslaved to these things.
Yeah.
And now that's like, with artificial intelligence and all of that stuff, it's like, what are we even in the same economic system that they said, oh, came back after 2008? Are we even in that same world anymore?
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Well, that might be a good segue to my last pick, which I think approaches that same concern sort of from maybe somewhat from an economic perspective, but also from just more of a kind of cultural, religious kind of identity perspective. And I picked this one. I could have picked a different one, but I picked this one, and I'll tell you why. I picked
hmm,
Joseph Ratzinger's Europe Today and Tomorrow. So now this book has actually been reissued with a new, I think, forward and epilogue, and it's called now Western Culture Today and Tomorrow. But this is the original one called Europe Today and Tomorrow. It came out in 2004, right before Ratzinger became Pope Benedict XVI. So it's 20 years old and it's timely. Actually, I was looking again at the very end. There are four talks at the very end that Ratzinger wrote to mark the 60th anniversary of D-Day, of the storming of basically the liberation of Europe, essentially, from the Nazis. And now we've just had the 80th. We've just had it just the other day, the 80th anniversary of D-Day. So 80 years ago today, um, France was on its way to being freed from the clutches of the Nazis, right? Those talks are wonderful. Everything in this book is wonderful, but the thing that runs throughout that is so important to me, and I think to us in our project at the Space Salvi Institute, is Ratzinger was keenly aware that I've said this so many times before, so have you, that Christianity and Europe are bound up in this. They're tangled up in ways that they can't be extracted one from the other. And so Ratzinger was concerned in the 90s, but then concerned again right on the eve of his becoming pope that the West, and that maybe is why the reissued version is called, Western culture rather than Europe Today and Tomorrow, but that the West had to rediscover its identity as Christian. And that indeed, he traces this throughout. And he's not the only one to do this, but he talks about the foundation of the European Union as being, fundamentally this attempt at reconstructing a Christian imperium after the Nazis had essentially destroyed what was left of Christendom in their kind of satanic empire. And it goes on and on and on from there. I could have picked, there are a number of things that Ratzinger wrote, several books, and other thinkers as well. But I wanted to pick something by Pope Benedict, by Ratzinger. And this, I think, I keep coming back to this book. So many great turns of phrases in here and bits of thought.
doesn't he begin that book with the question that Cardinal Glemp asks, like, what is Europe?
Yeah. What is Europe?
Does it end at the Ural Mountains, or like, which is like, again, one of these questions we need to ask. What is it? Um,
Yeah, I mean, he says Europe is not a continent that can be comprehended neatly in geographical terms. Rather, it is a cultural and historical concept.
Yeah.
And this is something that you find in Remy Bragg as well, who I would have picked Remy Bragg's eccentric culture, but I've already written about that and talked about that on our platform, so I decided not to. But I think to some degree you get this in Pierre Manon, you get this in Roger Scruton, you get this in some of the major thinkers that have shaped my thinking in recent years. I love that Ratzinger did it, not only because he became the Pope, and in a sense, like, he has there's a gravity to his saying these things that those other thinkers, just as brilliant as they are, just won't have. But also because I just think as a thinker, just without the Pope part, I think Ratzinger deserves to be at the top of the heap of all of these thinkers that we are continuing to sift through here now in the 20th century as sort of some of the great thinkers that bridge this gap between the 20th and the 21st century. Ratzinger's the biggest dog, I think.
Yeah. It's funny. I was not going to mention this book, but since it's on my desk, I'll just show it. And it's funny you mention this because Christopher Dawson, who's somebody I think, truly inspires what we're trying to do. His book, Understanding Europe. And actually, this book, again, I got this one for $1 on the shelf. It was a Cardinal George book. So I have all of his notes in here.
Wow.
He was reading tons. I got a lot of books by Dawson that actually were owned by Cardinal George. So it's actually great to see his little footnotes on the side. But one of the chapters I was reading on the tram ride home is actually titled Europe, Not a Continent, but a Society of Peoples.
Yep.
And he wrote this back in, what year is it? Um, 1960. And so he gets at, this thing. He talks about America. Okay, he says, yes, America is part of Western civilization, but yet
Hmm.
it's different.
Hmm.
It's not Europe. Why? And he goes in here, and I can't find it exactly right here, but he gives a definition of
Hmm.
what is Europe. And so I was thinking of Ratzinger's book the entire time.
Hmm.
So anyways, but no, that's a great book, Andrew, and it is interesting that I hope Pope Benedict eventually is called like a patron of Europe um
Hmm.
someday. Um
Yeah,
but
well, it's no accident, as we both noted. I mean, it's no accident that he took the name that he took. I mean, he
right.
took the name of the patron saint of Europe. And also, the previous Pope Benedict was somebody who lived at this particularly momentous time. He's not like a famous Pope, Pope Benedict the 15th, that we don't talk about him a whole lot, but he lived at basically the time, right, that Christendom collapsed in the 20th in the early 20th century, right? And I think that there's something to that Ratzinger wanted to identify himself with Saint Benedict and Pope Benedict the 15th.
Yeah. Um well, I think that actually the next book I'm going to recommend, it's a little bit different than the others, but it played a huge role in my formation. And when I was working as like doing the thing for Word on Fire Institute with education, this book was like foremost in my mind, which is Shop Class's Soulcraft by
Mm,
Matthew Crawford, an inquiry into the value of work. This book came out, it's again 2009. I think I read it that same summer that I read uh, Catholicism and Milbank's book. But this book was just like, wow. Growing up, I always wondered why we didn't have shop class in my education. And I remember I was always a little jealous that my grandpa and my father were just much more skilled with their hands than I
hmm.
was. And I know that my grandpa had shop class in high school. It was just part of the program. I'm not so sure if my dad did, but he learned it from my grandpa, and my dad was trying to teach me. But the little that I knew, I always felt this fulfillment. I don't know, this satisfaction in doing actually not just, kind of mindless manual labor,
Hmm.
but manual labor that actually required the use of your intellect. And I felt like that was much more intellectual sometimes
Hmm.
than actually what you're doing in the classroom. And so this book for me was just like, because I was, again, 2008, thinking, okay, what's the future here? They were already talking back then about um, kind of, I don't know if it was artificial intelligence yet, but easily replacing white collar jobs. I was like a little bit resentful that I went through this whole education system to prepare me to get basically a white collar job. And I never
Hmm.
was given any option about like studying the trades. And when I met my wife finally, I said, well, wait a minute, in Europe, you basically can, you from an early age, now there's some problems with that too, but from an early age, you can go to trade school. Um,
Hmm.
and anyways, this book for me, and I've been following Matthew Crawford ever since. Someday I hope to have him on the show.
Hmm.
I believe I don't know if it's like been announced yet, but I believe he's Catholic. It seems like when you read this book, you feel like, okay, the next person he's going to read is Romano Guardini, and
Hmm.
he's going to love the Lubach. He's going to love
Hmm.
all of these guys. But I remember a couple of years ago, he said, you know what? There's some friends of mine who've actually told me that early 20th century Catholic social thought has already said a lot of the things I'm getting at.
Yeah.
And they've been
Yeah.
seeing these things. And I think those friends were actually some of the people from the John Paul II Institute, like DC Schindler, Adrian Walker, who I believe is out in California with him. I believe it was actually who was actually teaching a course with Matthew Crawford.
Mm.
So I've been following Matthew Crawford. His book after this was The World Outside Our Head, or it was on human agency in a world that is just taking that away.
Hmm.
Um, and then his book on Why We Drive. Um, this he has a love for Nietzsche that I share, which is
Hmm.
this kind of desire to just connect with things.
Hmm.
Um, you know, he has this great line about, feeling your powers expanding. So kind of going back to the first book, sorry, but technology for him is not a bad thing. It's like we're going as human beings, we're going to have technology. That's what we do. But it's actually the kind of technology that we
Hmm.
have
Yeah.
that is reflective of a certain mentality. That is the issue. So the
Yeah.
ones that actually connect us to reality and expand our powers in that way is the good route that he's advocated.
Yeah. Well, I don't have any more books, but I this reminds me to go back to my first or my second book, Giussani, The Religious Sense. You remember you mentioned Nietzsche just a second ago. Giussani has this whole thing about how ultimately the elementary experience that we have when we kind of become aware of the religious sense, it's likely to make us either anarchists or Catholics, basically, right? Because he says like because the idea then that there's sort of infinity it then either makes us want to be kind of like Nietzsche and Superman or something and just sort of like be the masters of infinity and control everything and whatever. And this is where you get the splitting of the atom or whatever, right? This is where you get like the wrong kind of like progress in technology, right? But he said, but the alternative is you, in a sense, like you submit to infinity you become like you come to belong to it and then whatever you create like whatever you're doing is sort of like participating in that right it is like this whole kind of like Tolkien kind of like sub creating like with the creator type of thing which I think is basically from what I know of Matthew Crawford the kind of thing that he's saying.
Yeah. It's basically joining your voices in harmony with the choir, the heavenly spheres in some
Yeah.
sense. And
Yeah.
that's why, I mean, there's a liturgical dimension to it. I mean, he doesn't flesh it out, but it's in some ways like the human being as worker
Hmm.
is meant to align himself, herself to this more fundamental order, which in some ways is an order that is giving itself to you to participate in.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean.
Yeah,
And
and we that this will be for another day, but I mean this to me then also brings in a kind of resurrection theology which says eternity is not going to be passive, right?
yeah,
Like we'll be working, we'll be doing things that are still in the same vein of participation, right, in the divine work.
well, didn't Mary Magdalene think that the resurrected Jesus was the gardener?
Yeah, the gardener, exactly. Yeah. Well, maybe on that note, Bobby, we'll wrap up. I'm out of books. I'm not out of books, but I that's all I'm prepared to talk about today. What about you?
No, that was a lot of fun. We should do this again sometime.
Let's do it for sure. And maybe we can also talk about fiction in the future or films or something like that. To our listeners and viewers, we have some great interviews on the horizon. People have been really busy. It's summer is getting started, and it's hard to align schedules. So we decided to have a conversation, just the two of us today. But stand by for some really good conversations with some outside guests coming very, very soon. And if you like what you heard here and you like what you've heard in the back catalog, and you haven't done so already, please do go ahead and go to our website, spacealvyinstitute.com. Follow us on social media and be sure to give us a 5-star review to draw a little more attention to the work that we're doing. So until next time, God bless you all and live in hope.